Welcome back to another episode of Out Loud Geek, where we discuss news and views about pop culture, science fiction, fantasy, food, cooking, the outdoors, and more. One of the most popular superhero characters of all time is undoubtedly Marvel Comics character of Spider-Man. And this is demonstratable by the fact that any time that a new Spider-Man movie has been released in theaters, it has always done very well, as exemplified by the 6 MCU movies that he has appeared in, and the 5 live-action and 2 animated Sony and Columbia Pictures Marvel movies that he has also appeared in. And the 2 animated movies featured the Miles Morales version of the character instead of the Peter Parker version that was in the live-action movies. So that's 13 movies that have all done very well at the box office. Thus, it's a proven winning formula centered around a very popular comic book character, and audiences are always clamoring for more. But what if the next web-slinging movie does not actually have Spider-Man in it? Does this sound like a recipe for a successful movie at the box office? You might want to bear that question in mind as we get into this video. But before we proceed, I'd like to ask everyone to please like this video, please subscribe to this channel, and please press the bell to receive notifications. Thanks! So who exactly is going to be in this next web-slinging movie if it's not Spider-Man? Well, hold on to your hats, folks, because it's going to be 4 women. And not just 4 white women, oh no. It's going to be 4 diverse women because, you know, if you're going to make a big Hollywood blockbuster movie today, it has to be totally woke. So Sony and Columbia Pictures have clearly convinced themselves that in spite of the fact that people really want to see Spider-Man in a movie, they're going to try and convince them that what they actually want are 4 diverse Spider-Women who don't need no man to save them. They gonna save themselves. And the name of this upcoming movie is Madam Web, which is a name that may bring brothels into mind, not superheroes. But Sony and Columbia Pictures did not invent the name. There actually is a Marvel Comics character named Madam Web. But as you'll soon see, what Sony and Columbia Pictures is about to present as Madam Web is totally different from the original Marvel Comics concept for the character. And as I asked earlier in the video, does this sound like a recipe for a successful movie at the box office? Let's be honest. Just from the small amount of information that I have provided so far, this movie is starting to sound like it's going to be another example of the saying, go woke, go broke. Because on the purely figurative high heels of the worst performing MCU movie of all time that had 3 female protagonists and 1 female antagonist, Sony and Columbia Pictures are beginning 2024 with a movie entitled Madam Web that will feature an ensemble cast of 4 diverse female replacement protagonists for Spider-Man that most people have never heard of before. Do you remember last year when Warner Bros. Discovery and DC Studios released the superhero movie entitled Blue Beetle? I had released a video before Blue Beetle opened in theaters explaining who the character is, as well as its convoluted backstory that includes 4 different iterations of the character, and that it was essentially a D-list character that hardly anyone other than DC Comics aficionados had heard of. But that wasn't why Warner Bros. Discovery and DC Studios had greenlit this movie. No, they greenlit its production because it marked off woke identity politics checkboxes due to the 4th iteration of the Blue Beetle character being Latino, with an activist director who pissed off the movie's potential audience before the movie had even opened in theaters. So thanks to all of that, the movie was a box office disaster just as I had predicted it would be. In fact, it ended up being the lowest grossing DCEU movie of all time. Now, had the Blue Beetle character been paired up with a better-known and more popular DC superhero character for his first big-screen outing, that might have helped to develop a larger following that could have permitted a later standalone Blue Beetle movie to be more successful at the box office. But that kind of common sense in Hollywood has become increasingly rare today because pushing the woke identity politics message takes precedence over everything. Then, only months later, when Disney and Marvel Studios released their very woke feminist movie The Marvels last year, it also had a very similar problem in that hardly anyone was familiar with 2 of the 3 female protagonists that were featured in that movie. And that's not even including the large percentage of moviegoers who disliked the movie's main star, Brie Larson. So, not surprisingly, The Marvels wasn't just a box office failure, it became the worst performing movie of all time for the entire MCU and its 33 movies. That was quite the accomplishment that led to it being one of the biggest flops of 2023 and demonstrating once again the validity of the saying, "Go woke, go broke." So, basing movies on D-list superhero characters or all-female ensemble casts that include several D-list superhero characters does not appear to be a particularly profitable endeavor at the box office, does it? What does this then suggest for a movie with an even larger all-female ensemble cast that's completely filled with D-list superhero characters who don't necessarily match how they were originally described and depicted by Marvel Comics? Does this sound like a recipe for a successful movie at the box office? Let's consider the movie's titular character, Madam Web, aka Cassandra Webb, as played by the actress Dakota Johnson. According to Marvel Comics, Madam Web is supposed to be a paralyzed, blind, elderly old woman who is both a clairvoyant and precognitive mutant who's on a life support system that resembles a spider web, from which her name is derived. She was also only ever a supporting character in the comics, but Sony and Columbia Pictures have totally reimagined her as a young, 20-something paramedic who discovers that she has clairvoyant precognitive abilities after a near-death experience. So the changes that Sony and Columbia Pictures have introduced for their version of the Madam Web character as compared with the original comics include the following. She's young, she's not blind, she's not paralyzed, she works as a paramedic, she's connected to Peter Parker's Uncle Ben, who Sony has now transformed into a fellow paramedic working alongside her, she can fight, she has a very different costume from what was depicted in the comic books, she gains her powers through a near-death experience, she's intrinsically connected to Ezekiel Sims, she serves as a mother figure and mentor to other Spider-Women characters, and her dark aspects are totally ignored by Sony. About the only things that Sony and Columbia Pictures did not change were that she's a woman named Cassandra Webb with clairvoyant and precognitive abilities. So if Cassandra Webb is radically different from what was created by Marvel Comics, what about the movie's plot? Obviously, it's going to be radically different from anything written in the comic books because Madam Web was only ever a supporting character. From what I've been able to gather from my own research, the plot for this movie is apparently very loosely based on a series of Marvel comics for The Amazing Spider-Man, numbered 503 through 508, that were published in 2004 and are collectively known as the Book of Ezekiel due to the character of Ezekiel Sims. Here's Marvel's own description for the Book of Ezekiel. Peter Parker delves further into the mysterious totemic origins of his powers when the enigmatic Ezekiel Sims returns. Is he truly Peter's mentor and ally, or something much more? Plus, in the aftermath of an interdimensional rift caused by Spider-Man and Doctor Strange's battle with Dormammu, a sorceress of limitless power is set free from years of captivity. And she sets forth on a quest through Manhattan to properly thank the one responsible for it, the wall crawler himself. It guest stars Thor's stepbrother, Loki. So in other words, Sony and Columbia Pictures have taken a story written specifically about and for the character of Spider-Man, taken him out of it completely, and replaced him with 4 diverse women. Does this sound like a recipe for a successful movie at the box office? Here's Sony's plot synopsis for the Madam Web movie. In a switch from the typical genre, Madam Web tells the standalone origin story of one of Marvel's most enigmatic heroines. The thriller stars Dakota Johnson as Cassandra Webb, a paramedic in Manhattan who may have clairvoyant abilities. Forced to confront revelations about her past, she forges a relationship with 3 young women destined for powerful futures, if they can all survive a deadly present. The original Madame Web character was clearly not an enigmatic heroine. That was just a BS description. I don't know about those of you who are watching this video, but this entire movie sounds increasingly like a bastardization of an existing Marvel Comics story about altogether different characters in order to promote the feminist woke identity politics message. And who can we thank for this movie's plot? It was written by the team of Matt Sazama and Burke Sharpless, who are also known for 2014's Dracula Untold, which did actually break even, 2015's The Last Witch Hunter, which flopped, 2016's Gods of Egypt, which was a bigger flop, 2017's Power Rangers, which flopped, and 2022's Morbius, which also flopped. Does knowing this give you confidence that the movie was well written or that it will be successful at the box office? So now we'll quickly go over the other 3 diverse women in this female ensemble cast. First, there's Julia Carpenter, as played by Sydney Sweeney, who we'll refer to as Spider-Woman #1 and was originally introduced in the comics in 1984. Second is the diverse character Maddie Franklin, as played by Celeste O'Connor, who we can refer to as Spider-Woman #2 and was originally introduced in the comics in 1998 and 1999. And finally, the third diverse character is Anya Corazon, as played by Isabella Merced, who we can refer to as Spider-Girl as she is named in the comics, and was originally introduced in 2004, which was just 1 year before DC introduced its Latino 4th iteration of the character Blue Beetle. Now, in this Madame Web movie, Spider-Women #1 and #2, as well as Spider-Girl, each have just some random connection to the Madame Web character. But their connections in Marvel Comics are very different and a lot more complex. In the comics, Spider-Woman #1 gets her original powers after being tricked into joining a fake athletic study, but later inherits Madame Web's abilities as well as her blindness after Madame Web dies. Also in the comics, Spider-Woman #2 gets her powers after participating in a ritual that includes Madame Web. And finally, Spider-Girl in the comics gets her powers from a mage who saves her life, but she also has a connection to Madame Web because she's present when Madame Web dies and Spider-Woman #1 inherits her powers and blindness. And that occurs during another Spider-Man story called The Gauntlet and Grim Hunt, in which Kane is sacrificed to resurrect the character Kraven the Hunter. And who saved Spider-Girl and Spider-Woman #1 during that story? Spider-Man, the one character who is absent from this Madame Web movie. Remember what I said earlier in this video? These 4 woke diverse women don't need no man to save them. And again, does this sound like a recipe for a successful movie at the box office? Well, Box Office Pro released its first set of predictions for Madame Web, and they're not particularly good. Right now, they're only predicting a domestic opening weekend box office ranging from $25 million to $35 million. To take that into perspective, since 1997, Sony and Columbia Pictures have released 15 Marvel movies, 3 Men in Black movies, 2 Ghost Rider movies, 2 Venom movies, 1 Morbius movie, and 7 Spider-Man movies, of which 5 are live action but 2 are animated. The average domestic opening weekend box office for these 15 movies is $73.2 million, and the standard deviation is $36.2 million. So one standard deviation below the average is $37 million, and only 2 of the current Sony and Columbia Pictures Marvel movies had domestic opening weekend box office earnings that were below $37 million. 2012's Ghost Rider Spirit of Vengeance and 2018's animated movie Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. The latter of those 2 movies went on to break even and make a profit, But Ghost Rider Spirit of Vengeance is one of the 3 Sony and Columbia Pictures Marvel movies to either decisively or marginally flop in theaters. So the entire predicted domestic opening weekend box office range for Madame Web falls between the $22.1 million that Ghost Rider Spirit of Vengeance earned and the $35.4 million that Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse earned during their respective opening weekends. And it's also more than 1 standard deviation below the group's average. To project what the final domestic box office earnings for Madame Web might be, I'll use a range of average weekly drops that are 1 standard deviation above and below the average for the group of the 15 Sony and Columbia Pictures Marvel movies, which is 33.92%. And with a standard deviation of 10.38%, that gives me a range of possible average weekly drops ranging from 23.53% to 44.3%, which is a fairly wide range. So if I use the $30 million midpoint of Box Office Pro's predicted range as the approximate domestic opening weekend box office, along with that wide range of possible average weekly drops, I can project that the movie's final domestic box office may range somewhere between $67.8 million at the low end, $88.4 million at the mid-range, and $126.5 million at the upper end, which is a higher overall range than what Box Office Pro is predicting for the movie's final domestic box office, $56 million to $101 million. But when I instead use the $25 million lower end of their predicted domestic opening weekend box office range, then I project a range of possible final domestic box office earnings that range from $56.4 million at the low end, $73.7 million at the mid-range, and $105.4 million at the upper end. So since that's so close to the final domestic box office range being predicted by Box Office Pro, that strongly suggests to me that they are far more inclined to believe that the movie's domestic opening weekend box office is going to be a lot closer to $25 million than $35 million. And to provide some context to the other Sony and Columbia Pictures Marvel movies, these possible final domestic box office ranges for Madame Web are close to what the 3 lowest performing movies within this group earned domestically. The $51.8 million that 2012's Ghost Rider Spirit of Vengeance earned domestically, the $73.9 million that 2022's Morbius earned domestically, and the $115.8 million that 2007's Ghost Rider earned domestically. To project what the final global gross box office for Madame Web might be, I will use the average domestic share for the 15 Sony and Columbia Pictures Marvel movies, which is 40.97%, and 1 standard deviation above and below, which is a range from 31.62% to 50.32%. And when I do that, for the range that began with a possible domestic opening weekend box office of $30 million, I get a range of possible final global gross box office earnings ranging from a low of $165.3 million at the low end, $215.8 million at the mid-range, and $308.7 million at the upper end. But if I begin from the possible domestic opening weekend box office of $25 million, then I get a range of possible final global gross box office earnings ranging from a low of $137.7 million at the low end, $179.8 million at the mid-range, and $257.3 million at the upper end. So that $5 million difference during the opening weekend can make a huge difference down the line in terms of what the final domestic and global gross box office earnings might be. In terms of context, in comparison with the other 15 Sony and Columbia Pictures Marvel movies, these possible ranges of final global gross box office earnings for Madame Web are similar to this group's 3 lowest performing movies. The $149.2 million that 2012's Ghost Rider Spirit of Vengeance earned globally, the $162.8 million that 2022's Morbius earned globally, and the $229.5 million that 2007's Ghost Rider earned globally. Now, if Madame Web could earn as much as $35 million during its domestic opening weekend, then the most that it might earn for its final global gross box office earnings would be around $360.2 million. and that would still be less than the $375.5 million that 2018's Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse earned, which is the fourth lowest grossing movie globally for the 15 Sony and Columbia Pictures Marvel movies. It would also be just barely half of what Sony and Columbia Pictures' lowest grossing live-action Spider-Man movie earned, 2014's The Amazing Spider-Man 2, which earned $709 million. So as I have been asking throughout this video, was the decision to produce a Madam Web movie with 4 diverse female superhero protagonists a recipe for box office success? I'm going to have to say no. For those of you who have made it this far into the video, I'm sure you're wondering whether Madam Web will break even. To answer this question, I have to look into the movie's production budget, and the estimates that are currently being reported range from $80 million to $100 million, which isn't unrealistic because Sony and Columbia Pictures haven't spent as much to produce their Marvel movies overall as Disney and Marvel Studios have. That being said, my best estimate for the movie's production budget is around $90 million, which is the midpoint for the estimates that I have been seeing online. And when I multiply that estimated $90 million production budget by 2.5 and 3.0 to account for the 50% of gross box office ticket sales that movie theaters keep for themselves, as well as the additional costs of marketing the movie and other miscellaneous costs that the studio pays above and beyond the production budget, that gives me an estimated break-even point ranging from between $225 million to $270 million. So based on the projected final global gross box office ranges that I calculated, I will also project that Madam Web has less than a 50% chance of breaking even. But it probably won't lose that much money, certainly nowhere near as much as the Marvels did last year. And with that, I will now close out this video. I will be tracking this movie's box office after it opens in theaters next month, and I am curious to see how much money it ends up losing. Thanks for watching today, and a huge thanks to everyone who has subscribed to our channel. We appreciate your support. If you enjoyed this video, please press the like button, and please feel free to share a comment. If you'd like to help support this channel, please press the red subscribe button, and please press the bell to receive notifications for new content. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, Threads, and Twitter by clicking on the links in the description. Until next time, this is Out Loud Geek.